Welcome to the NFRW Empower Hour. I am your host, Glynis Chester. So happy that you could join me this evening. You are here for, hello, you are here to learn about issues that are forefront in today's culture. We are going to give you the tools to speak with authority on important topics in today's political landscape. That's what the Empower Hour is all about. And today we have got a fantastic program. You are absolutely going to love it. You are all aware, very well aware, I'm sure, of the crisis on our southern border. I know because I'm in Texas, I probably talk about it more than anyone wants to hear, but it is a crisis. And with the increase of illegal crossings, we've also had an increase in both the drug trade and human trafficking trade as well. Our special guest this evening has worked on the front lines fighting against drug cartels for over 30 years. And he's going to lay out the unholy trinity of drugs, cartels, and open borders, not only how they intersect, but also how they affect you in your state. So I want to warn you now, this is going to be a very, very powerful Empower Hour, but this program is for mature audiences. So I do want to say, if you have small children, even young teens, even young teens in the room, I suggest, you know what, turn off your computer. Next week, when we have this video on the NFRW website, tune in then, pick it up when you don't have any kids around. This is not something you want little ones to see, even looking over your shoulder. But this is really, really important information that you need to have as an adult. So our regular housekeeping, please keep yourselves muted. If you have any questions, which I know you will, please type them into the chat and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the program. A huge thank you to Erica Watley, my right-hand man, or woman, sorry, who provides tech support on our program. I couldn't do this without you, Erica, thank you. And finally, don't forget to let your clubs know that we have past episodes of this program available on the NFRW website in the resource library. They're super easy to find, and you can get everything we've done for the entire term. So with all of that done, I am very, very excited to introduce my guest for this evening. Jeffrey Stamm spent over 30 years as a special agent with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. His assignments included domestic posts, like Texas and California, but also foreign regions as far away as Pakistan and Afghanistan. At DEA HQ, he served as a deputy chief of internal operations and ultimately as a special agent in charge of DEA's Global Aviation Division. Following his retirement from DEA in 2016, he was appointed to the, and I have to write this down, he was appointed as the executive director of the Midwest High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. That sounds like a really big area, for the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. There, he coordinated drug control efforts with local, state, and federal drug control counterparts across the heartland of America until 2022. He currently resides in Dallas with his sweet wife, Jill, and continues speaking, writing, and hot rodding. I would love to hear more about that at another time. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please tell us everything we need to know about the cartels.
Well, Glynis, first, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to be a part of your group of patriots here today. And I'm actually here for one simple reason, and that is that all of you need to know what I know, how open borders are currently fueling the greatest drug crisis in this country's history, crime, social decay of every sort. You also need to know that we're not just fighting Mexican drug cartels, we're fighting the world's most powerful and prolific narco-terrorists, who happen to be based in Mexico. Narco-terrorists that not only control the entirety of the US-Mexico border, but have their greatest foreign presence outside their country, right here in ours. Now, we're constantly told that we have to look at things through a prism of nuance, through moral and cultural relativism. But sometimes things really are just about black and white, right and wrong, good and evil. Drug trafficking and abuse is unquestionably one of those things. So is terrorism. And so is everything in between. Former U.S. Attorney Andrew McCarthy once said that civilization does not come about, nor does it survive by accident. It must be defended. It must be upheld by those committed to civility, decency, and adherence to the law. Our society is not some naturally occurring evolution, but is actually the imposition of human good or human evil. And as we know, the good requires constant reinforcement, whereas the bad just needs permission. And as we go about fighting our various enemies and adversaries, both foreign and domestic, there will be no easy political fix, no magic bullet. Next slide. What we do is hard, and it's hard all the time. Do we have the second slide up?
Yes, we're addressing the threat.
No, go back one, please.
Oh, here.
Okay, that quote actually comes from the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. And to be fair, he was actually talking about trying to stem the flow of narco dollars to the bad guys in that place at that time. But, you know, that applies to all of us right here, right now as well. This is not a war on drugs we're engaged in, not literally. It's a struggle. It's a hard, perpetual struggle against complex social, criminal, and pharmacological forces pushing constantly and insidiously against the safety and well-being of our citizens. And as drug trafficking and international terrorism increasingly intersect and converge, this problem is no longer one that simply involves our public health and public safety, but also our very national security. Next slide. Now, before I go any farther, I just do want to mention our national drug control strategy. This is it in a nutshell. This is not just a law enforcement problem. It will take all three legs of the stool: treatment, prevention, and enforcement. But no matter what particular concentration one focuses on or works in, all of us, I think, run the risk of falling into Maslow's trap, wherein he warned that if a hammer is your preferred tool, then every problem looks like a nail. Thus, the same humility that our drug law enforcers have had to accept over the years concerning their complete or nearly complete inability to solve the problem alone must also be accepted by those engaged in the treatment and prevention arenas. And as imperfect as our drug control strategy has been and continues to be, it's a lot like Winston Churchill's famous observation about democracy, that it's the worst system ever devised by mankind, except for all the others. Next slide. Okay, if you take a look at the similarities between foreign terrorist organizations and drug trafficking organizations, you'll find that they're remarkably similar. The only difference really is just a matter of degree. You see, terrorists look to overthrow the entire existing political order, replace everything with a system of socialism or communism or perhaps an Islamic caliphate. Drug traffickers, not so much. They only look to degrade and erode those government forces that oppose them, usually the police, so they can continue to operate within the weakened husk of the nation state to make money off the backs of addiction. They're both single-minded, zealous, highly ethnocentric, and shockingly violent. They both operate in highly compartmentalized and cellularized structures. They both depend on what we call shadow facilitators, those ancillary support players that provide weapons or chemicals or money laundering services. And one last thing, whether we like it or not, both the terrorists and the traffickers take our forgiving multiculturalism and our moral and cultural relativism as a weakness. Next slide. Now, everybody knows about the ABCs of WMD, but for the most part, these are potential threats to Americans on any given day. It's actually that fourth letter there in our alphabet soup that's currently killing 110,000 Americans every single year and continuing to rise. That's on average more than 300 a day. Let me ask you, what do you think our mainstream media would report on every evening if 300 dolphins were to wash up dead on our beaches every single day? Well, of course, you know the answer to that. But in addition to those drug overdose deaths, more accurately defined as drug poisonings, because for many of these drugs, there is no safe dosage, 4 million Americans enter substance abuse treatment programs annually. 2 million visit hospital emergency rooms suffering from overdose symptoms. 1/4 of them, by the way, from that safe, natural drug, marijuana. And lastly, illegal drugs now cost our society over $3 trillion in lost productivity, social, criminal, health-related costs of every kind. If I were going to introduce a substance to try to hollow out or destroy a society from within, I could think of nothing better than drugs to do it with. Next slide. There we go. Okay. Every year, Americans spend over $150 billion a year buying illegal drugs. Ultimately, roughly half of that, or about 75 billion, finds its way into the coffers of the various Mexican drug cartels across Mexico. That kind of money doesn't just destabilize the country. It allows these transnational criminal groups to become more powerful than the very federal government in that country. Now, if you remember the Colombian cartels of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you obviously remember how incredibly good they were at combining international drug trafficking with new levels of violence. But today, the Mexicans make them look like pikers. In addition to new levels of violence that clearly transcend the definition of what we have always defined as terrorism, the Mexican drug cartels have also become highly adept at what global economists describe as market diversification, both the vertical and horizontal integration of markets. Vertically, meaning they've come to dominate every level of the supply chain, from production, transportation, smuggling across borders, wholesale distribution, even retail level sales, not just on the streets of America, but increasingly the world. But also horizontally, meaning they branched out into new types of drugs not traditional to Mexico, beginning with methamphetamine in the 90s. And of course, as we know so well today, fentanyl. But even beyond drugs themselves, to new types of organized crime, beyond mere human smuggling and extortion and auto theft, to include illegal mining and logging, illegal fishing, the trafficking of exotic species to China. You know, there's a slang term used all across Mexico today called a huachicolero, which roughly translates into an oil pirate. Every 90 minutes now, there's an illegal tap on a Pemex oil pipeline sanctioned by one of the drug cartels designed to steal and sell oil on the black market. It's about to bring that state-run oil company to its knees. Now, you don't necessarily have to be an expert on the various territorial boundaries of the cartels in Mexico, but you might want to know who's in your own backyard. Next slide. From time to time, DEA puts this map out showing cartel presence, ownership really, of many of our big cities across the country. But for the most part, this map just depicts DEA's large division offices. It's actually Homeland Security that's estimated that the various Mexican cartels have a presence in over 3,000 cities and towns across America in all 50 states. They are here solely to sell dope to Americans and engage in other types of organized crime. I can think of no greater modern example of Cicero's warning to his fellow Romans about allowing an enemy within the gates. Next slide. Now, just like international terrorists, every single one of the Mexican cartels today engage in violence and terrorism and barbarity to accomplish two goals. Number one, quite obviously, it tends to cow and crush any opposition, be it the government, the public, or rival traffickers. Secondly, and this may actually be the more important of the two, is that it tends to intensify and invigorate faith among their members. We've had just a handful of Mexican sicarios or executioners, hitmen, cooperate with US authorities and talk about how absolutely exhilarating it is to kill on behalf of your cartel, your organization, to cut somebody's heart out, to skin somebody alive and cut his hands off, placing them on his throat to announce to the world that he was a snitch. And I would remind you that terrorism is not a specific entity or a particular ideology. It's a tactic, and it's a tactic being employed every single day in Mexico to not just move dope better into the United States, but to engage in organized crime on a global scale. Next slide. And all of these cartels have set up terrorist training camps in Mexico. This one here, seized by the Mexican government recently, belonged to the Zetas, was just 60 miles south of the US border. You know, for many years, we have, as a government, we have lectured the Pakistanis that they must not allow themselves to be used as safe haven for terrorists fleeing Afghanistan, taking up refuge in their country. Well, let me ask you, when the Mexican government brings the heat, as they occasionally do, against these cartels and narco terrorists, where do you think their safe haven is? That's right. They seemingly saunter across the border at will, taking up refuge in our country. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been fundamentally unserious about protecting ourselves at our southern border, not just from drug smugglers and human traffickers, but from narco terrorists. Next slide. Now, the term war on drugs does in fact come from Richard Nixon in 1971, but it was not a literal call to war. It was designed to be a metaphorical call to arms, the moral equivalent to war, in exactly the same way that his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, had done with his war on poverty, or subsequently, Jimmy Carter had done with his war on cancer. And by the way, have we won those two wars yet? But it's a little remembered today that Nixon's main weapon in his war on drugs was actually drug treatment. Nixon increased funding for drug treatment and prevention programs 8-fold within 2 years, consuming nearly 2/3 of the entire drug control budget and dwarfing monies allocated to the supply side or enforcement programs across government. But the president and the nation would come to learn the limitations of government's ability to affect individual behavior solely through compassionate or therapeutic means. You see, without the ability to compel addicts into long-term treatment, initial drug treatment failed 90 to 95% of the time. By the way, fast forward to today, and treatment fails 90 to 95% of the time. That's why it's called a chronic relapsing condition. In fact, Boston University recently issued a study that found that the average number of drug treatment episodes is 6.9 times over a 6.5-year period before it finally takes hold. And by the way, that study didn't even include the number of people who died of overdoses along the way. So too with drug prevention. We so want to believe that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, but after long-term study of many drug prevention programs, we've learned that unless we simultaneously reduce drug availability on the streets of America, most drug prevention programs have been found to be, quote, largely ineffectual. What did make a difference in Nixon's day was actually reducing the supply of drugs on the streets of America by turning the Corsican Italian mafia supplying the vast majority of heroin to Americans at that time known as Connect. It was law enforcement that staunched this nation's first opioid epidemic. And it would be law enforcement that would do it again and again against future drug threats, future transnational criminal organizations. Folks, here's one of my main messages today, and that is that given the known limitations of drug prevention and treatment programs, strategically, law enforcement may actually be the most effective and the most compassionate long-term drug prevention and treatment program available to us today. And we should say so without apology. Next slide. But we're made to believe that our prisons are filled with drug users, that mass incarceration has been spawned by the drug war. These aren't just misguided notions, they're dangerous lies. On any given day in our country, there are roughly 1.4 million prisoners behind bars in all of our state prisons. And of that total, according to the US Department of Justice, less than 15% are there for drug offenses. But that's not the figure I want you to look at. I want you to look at the other side of that equation. 85% of our state inmates are there for robbery, murder, grand larceny. Ladies and gentlemen, our prisons are not filled with drug users. They're not even filled with drug traffickers. They're filled with violent criminals and serial thieves. And they are exactly where they need to be if we care anything at all about the protection of our society. Next slide. Now, by now, everybody knows we're in the middle of an opioid epidemic. Fentanyl, principally, is currently driving about 3/4 of all of our drug overdose deaths in this country. But America doesn't just have an opioid problem, it has a drug problem. Overdose deaths are also on the rise from other drugs, principally cocaine and methamphetamine. And it's all going completely out of control for one simple reason. The Mexican cartels are flooding this country with cheap, pure, highly addictive drugs by the ton. And we seem to be incapable or lack the will to stop any of it. Next slide. Fentanyl seizures on our southern border have increased 650% in the last 4 years. In just a couple of years prior to that, there was no such thing as illicit fentanyl coming out of Mexico. That kind of increase is not measured in arithmetic terms, but rather in geometric ones. And this year, 2023, is shaping up to not just break last year's record, but to completely shatter it. Next slide. Now, this quote comes from a former opioid addict who made that statement to a journalist just a few days before he overdosed and died, and presumably even maybe met God. But that's a pretty important quote there that indicates from the mind of a drug user how intensely pleasurable, how neurochemically alluring drugs can be to the human mind. So alluring that many people choose to ignore their potential pitfalls, including death itself. That's why drugs are controlled. That's why drugs have to be made illegal in some form or fashion. Next slide. Now, by now, I hope everybody knows that the evidence is incontrovertible, that today's opioid epidemic has been principally fueled and sparked by the American pharmaceutical industry. Beginning in 1996, when they first started pumping out their legal opioid prescription pills across the country. But the prescription pill phenomenon actually explodes the myth that it's been the war on drugs or the illegality of drugs that's been the problem. These drugs are completely legal, regulated, taxed, but still highly abused. It proves the fact that every drug crisis is about two things: drug availability and drug acceptability. And it's also about the drugs themselves that don't merely provide euphoria or intoxication, but rather godlike sensations. Next slide. Our most tolerant and compassionate nation now welcomes into this world one baby born every 15 minutes suffering from the horrid effects of opioid withdrawal. And that doesn't even include the number of babies born to mothers on other drugs. Moreover, we now spend over $1 billion in Medicaid costs alone treating NAS across the country, with absolutely no moral strings attached to the moms and dads whatsoever. Now, it's been said that modern science has come a long way in figuring out how to treat these tiniest of victims with microdoses of drugs like buprenorphine, but their suffering is still said to be excruciating. It's been said that the moral worth of people can be judged by how they treat the most vulnerable and innocent among them. By this standard, our modern culture's stupefying indulgence of the irresponsible at the expense of the blameless and defenseless suggests a culture that's become enfeebled and cowardly in the face of vice. Next slide. Methamphetamine, as I alluded to earlier, it's also out of control. We've seen a tenfold increase in methamphetamine in this past decade. Tenfold. There's more methamphetamine coming into this country from Mexico than was ever produced clandestinely, domestically by outlaw motorcycle gangs in this country. Moreover, up to DEA's Special Testing and Research Lab, the average purity level at the retail level, the gram level across the country, is 97%. There's so much cheap, available methamphetamine pumped into this country at the hands of Mexican narco terrorists today that most retail level distributors don't even bother stepping on. But here's the main point I want to make about methamphetamine that many of our law enforcement colleagues never stop to realize. And that is this: that although methamphetamine only drives about 10 to 15% of all of our overdose deaths, poisonings in this country, overdose is only actually one measure of any drug crisis. The other one's crime. And since we know that as much as 2/3 of all crime in this country is directly attributable to illegal drug use and or trafficking, both property and violent crime, and since we know that methamphetamine is used and trafficked at 15 times the volume of opioids, theoretically, meth drives 15 times the crime, the violence, the gangs, the drive-bys, the social decay of every sort. Don't get me wrong, every single drug overdose death is tragic. But in terms of crime and social decay, in terms of our law enforcers having to respond to these issues, methamphetamine is 15 times larger of a problem. Next slide. And the Mexicans are making it by the ton in these large super industrial labs scattered all over Mexico with precursor chemicals profusely supplied by China by the ton, by the pallet load. Next slide. Make no mistake, here's who's in charge of Mexico now, just like the warlords in Afghanistan. It's the thugs, the desperados, the narco terrorists in Mexico who now call the shots. There is no dispute over that anymore. And Americans had better start thinking about what this means long-term for the safety, well-being, and national security of our country to have this on our southern border, not just a failed state, but a narco state. Next slide. Okay, switching gears just a bit, couple of slides on marijuana. Marijuana is what I call the cultural fault line of our time, where roughly half of our citizens today believe legalizing marijuana, it all in all is a good thing. Well, I believe that half of our population have been duped, pawns in a colossal con at the hands of legalizers who promote a soothing fairy tale. Well, those legalizers, those lobbying groups have actually been effective using two things: an appeal to emotion and endless repetition. And by the way, those are the two key ingredients to propaganda. Next slide. That, and of course, a whole bunch of money from far left billionaires like George Soros through his Drug Policy Alliance. He's actually known as Daddy Weed Bucks to the marijuana legalization lobby. Personally contributed over $100 million. And one of the main reasons that 96% of all the funding that goes toward marijuana ballot initiatives across the United States have funded the pro side. Clearly out to achieve a one world socialist government, open borders, mass immigration, the demobilization of our military, and lastly, his greatest objective is the legalization of not just marijuana, but all drugs. He is truly out to transform this nation, and he's doing a pretty good job of it. Next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no such thing. There's no other medicine in our pharmacological field that's been approved for ingestion by smoking its raw form versus medicines that are carefully isolated, purified, measured, and then administered in exact accordance with a particular illness or condition. Medical marijuana is just like the snake oil sales of the 19th century, where we're supposed to believe that weed can cure any ailment for anyone at any time and in any amount simply on the recommendation of a doctor. It's nothing but a triumph of propaganda. Next slide. The average medical marijuana user today in our country is 30 years old, has been smoking weed for 15 years, and has absolutely no major medical condition. Recently, the commander of the U.S. Army Recruiting Command has publicly stated that 75% of our young people today are currently unfit for military duty. 75%. Failing either physically, meaning they are too obese or out of shape to be able to pass the PT test, cognitively, they can't pass the Armed Forces Vocational Aptitude Test, or morally, meaning they have an arrest record or they're using some other illegal drug. Marijuana has been a huge driver in all three of those. You know, just prior to World War II, Franklin Roosevelt said that we cannot always build the future for our youth, but we can build our youth for the future. Are we still doing that? Next slide. Folks, our greatest enemies in this struggle are actually not the drug dealers, the narco terrorists, the gangbangers. It's our own societal ignorance and indifference. And as we know, those are both contagious, but so are courage and engagement. You can push back. You must push back. Every night in your city, there are parents praying that their children not get exposed to drugs. You can help be an answer to those prayers. Next slide. Now, I'd like to propose 4 broad areas that I think as a nation, as a culture, we need to move forward on to push back against this existential threat. Next slide. First, the public needs to know what law enforcement knows, that drugs don't simply destroy individual lives and steal individual souls, but decays, degrades, and devastates entire communities and peoples. That despite the liberal narrative, we are not engaged in mass incarceration, nor are our prisons filled with mere drug users. that marijuana is in fact a principal driver, not because it's a gateway drug. Oh, sure, it's all of that. But also given modern THC levels, marijuana today acts as a kind of catalyst that primes the brain for other types of psychoactive substances. Most people have no idea how truly dangerous the world has become, how many people and organizations are actively trying to prey upon and destroy our country and our citizens. They need to be taught. Next slide. We're constantly lectured to that we must not stigmatize those who are addicted and thus need our help. Well, I don't believe anyone, public or private, actually targets for abuse those who willingly step forward seeking help for their demons. No, that's a straw man argument designed to absolve drug users of any responsibility. But since we know that the vast majority of drug addiction begins as recreational drug taking, that's precisely the behavior that we need to stigmatize, at least every bit as much as our society has done with tobacco. We have to stigmatize the 15-year-old boy who thinks he's cool smoking weed with his buddies after school, the college girl who thinks she's sophisticated ordering fentanyl from the dark web or Snapchat and paying for it with some virtual currency like Bitcoin or Zcash. And lastly, most importantly, we must stigmatize those social, political, and media influences that normalize and glamorize drug use. Next slide. What I'm talking about here is individual responsibility. At its core, the problem of illicit drugs in our country is not caused by poverty, racism, social dysphoria, or any other supposed root cause. It's about individuals not taking control of their own lives, leading healthy, safe, lawful lifestyles. Quite simply, individual character and lawful behavior matter. They matter for self, and cumulatively, they matter for society. If not, then the country's resources will be exhausted in efforts to save the citizens from themselves, whether or not narcotics are legalized. Next slide. Law enforcement does not have the resources remotely proportionate to this threat. We must substantially increase funding to law enforcement at every level, local, state, federal, and yes, absolutely at the Mexican border where we know the threat emanates from. We know with 300 Americans dying on average every single day that drug dealing is not a nonviolent crime. In fact, it has been rightfully called the most murderous criminal activity in the history of America. We know after 50 years of experience since Nixon declared his war on drugs that drug treatment and prevention programs are absolutely essential, but they're only strategically effective when we can reduce drug availability on the streets of America. We do that not just by targeting the drugs, but the drug dealers. We proved that law enforcement works against LSD in the 60s, heroin in the 70s, cocaine in the 80s, crack in the 90s, meth labs in the 2000s. All of those reductions were not complete, but they were greatly achieved through the fair yet vigorous application of law. Back in the early 1980s, when cocaine first started pouring out of Colombia, President Reagan picked up the phone and he called his counterpart in Bogota and he said that you guys either need to start doing something yourselves to stem the production and export of cocaine from your country, or you might as well stop sending us any of your coffee and cut flowers and oil. And you know what? Colombia stepped up and became one of our greatest allies ever since in this global struggle. We need that same tough love right now with Mexico. And maybe more importantly, given the precursor chemical flows and money laundering activities, with China. Lastly, here's the big one, folks. I'd like for you to consider this as a homework assignment tomorrow, to call your congressman and senator and demand that every single one of Mexico's drug cartels be declared as a foreign terrorist organization pursuant to Title 8 U.S. Code, Section 1189. That's 8 U.S.C. 1189, to bring new tools to bear, new resources to bear in what clearly is an existential threat to this nation. We used to do all of these things. We need to resuscitate, reinvigorate all of them. Next slide. Now, in my law enforcement audiences that I talk with, I spent some time talking about what I call the 5 C's, but I just want to mention point number 4 there. We absolutely need to have compassion for our fellow man, but not just for those who are addicted today, but also for the hordes who will be victimized tomorrow, for the children today who have a right to grow up in a drug-free environment, for the 90% of Americans who do not use illegal drugs and therefore uphold the law and not degrade and demean it. Compassion is different than mere sympathy. Sympathy is just an emotion. True compassion is actually sympathy coupled with action, the kind of action designed to achieve justice and fairness. Next slide. Now, these are my three kids, and quite obviously they've chosen a different path in life than I have in my law enforcement career, but they understand the same thing all of you do. The civilization must be defended, that this is our society, one worth fighting for, and fight we must, not just with caring and compassion, but also with an aggressive and wide-ranging drug law enforcement response that upholds the rule of law and what is right, against a constant onslaught of predators who only look to get rich off the backs of addiction. To not target, arrest, and imprison those who prey upon our fellow citizens, sometimes with unimaginable violence and barbarity, is not just cowardly, it's immoral. Next slide. Now we're going to finish up here in about 1 minute, but a little obscene self-promotion for the book that I published upon my retirement from DEA. It's not about me at all. It's actually a set of academic arguments to push back against all of the apologists, appeasers, legalizers of every kind, outlining why we need a good, strong drug law enforcement response. I invite you to check it out at Amazon.com. Now, let me finish with this. It is absolutely true, unfortunately, that the bad guys enjoy some distinct tactical advantages over us. First of all, they obey no laws. Secondly, they adhere to no policies and procedures that we must, being accountable to government at the local, state, or federal level. And lastly, as we've seen, quite often they comply with no civilizational standards of any kind. But by God, they're not smarter than we are, nor are they more committed to preserving and maintaining our society. So when you leave this call and return to this great fight, don't ever let the critics get you down. Don't ever let them make you think that enforcing our legitimate drug laws and securing our sovereign borders are anything other than the most necessary and critical tools at our disposal. Remember always the words of Teddy Roosevelt, who said that it's not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man or woman who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best, in the end, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. To all of you American patriots, I thank you for your time tonight. And Glynis, I will turn it back to you for some Q&A.
Thank you so much. That was very educational. And I do see that we have a couple of questions. Erica, can you roll some of those out for us?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
We keep hearing about the increase of Chinese cartels. How do Mexican, Chinese, and Central American cartels maintain the same space?
Well, they essentially don't maintain the same space. It's been estimated that there are roughly about 250,000 members of Chinese organized crime, or triads as they call them, most of whom are scattered throughout Asia. In fact, the Mexican cartels have formed alliances with the Chinese triads, not just for the acquisition of precursor chemicals, but also to help move cocaine into China and throughout Asia. Little known fact that the price of a kilo of cocaine in communist China, if you have the guts and the connections to sell cocaine in communist China, brings about a 10 times the value of what a kilo of cocaine can be sold here in the US. So the Mexicans have a very symbiotic relationship with the Chinese cartels to not just move cocaine into Asia, but also the precursor chemical acquisition for drug labs. And I would also point out as well that it's been said that the relationship that the communist Chinese government has with Chinese organized crime is also symbiotic. The communist government largely leaves them untouched as long as the triads agree to not engage in violent criminal activity inside China. while simultaneously promoting the greater China policies throughout the world. So the Chinese government, the communist government, in my opinion, is complicit in international drug trafficking as well.
All righty. What else you got?
I tried to grab this. Please repeat what it is that we are to tell our legislators. I believe this is in reference to the 8 USC 1189. Is that?
Yes, that allows the government to declare any organization throughout the world to be a foreign terrorist organization. And by the way, 8 USC 1189 requires no legislation, requires no funding. It is simply the ability of the Secretary of State to make a declaration pursuant to the safety and well-being of our government to declare any organization as an FTO. Now, I don't believe Secretary Blinken from the State Department is going to do that on his own. He needs to be shamed into doing so to protect the American people. And once again, I don't think declaring Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations will be the panacea, but it certainly will unlock a set of options and tools and resources to be able to better protect our citizens in this country.
Let's see. Are the Mexican cartels pushing guns across the border in some measure as means for product to be protected through corridors to distribution hubs?
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I'll take a stab at it. I think Mexican cartels, first of all, don't just have regular weapons. They have military grade weapons from throughout the world that they're able to acquire through international contacts. In fact, recent reporting just last week indicates that the Gulf Cartel has in their possession anti-tank shoulder-fired missiles that they've acquired, what they believe is from Ukraine, Swedish AT-4 anti-tank missiles purchased from corrupt sources in Ukraine. We also have a tremendous amount of military hardware left over in Afghanistan, by the way, that's currently on the black market that will produce repercussions for decades to come as well. But certainly the Mexican cartels have, as I said earlier in my presentation, have a presence in just about every medium and large city across the United States. And with those salespeople, those cartel emissaries, if you will, they certainly bring weapons to enforce their edicts and their activities. There's no indication that they're bringing military-grade weapons into the country to engage in some of these traffic or terroristic disputes inside America, but clearly that's a possibility in the future. But make no mistake, the Mexican cartels are armed on both sides of the border. And they are violent and very willing to engage in terroristic acts to achieve their objectives.
And you answered this one, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. Do you think the USG should designate the cartels as foreign terrorist groups? Pro says that it gives law enforcement agency more tools, and con is that terror groups and cartels are not quite the same thing. And if we do that, it will open up possibility of successful asylum claims for much of the population in Mexico.
Well, I've heard that asylum claims argument that would enable anyone fleeing Mexico to claim asylum because of there's terrorism in their country. Just to remind folks out there that we have foreign terrorist organizations designated in Colombia with the FARC, in Peru with the Shining Path, in Turkey with the PKK, in obviously Afghanistan with the Taliban and ISIS and northern Syria. Now, and we don't recognize that as a problem, that we have to automatically take all of those citizens into this country as asylees. I would also say that there are some people out there like Lindsey Graham who think that designating Mexican cartels as FTOs will enable the U.S. military to engage in operations and hit drug labs across Mexico. I think that's a very dangerous assumption. Number one, we don't have the ability to engage militarily in another sovereign country. If Mexico invites us in to work cooperatively, that's wonderful. But I think to assume that militarily that designating cartels as FTOs will be the panacea is very far off the mark. What most it would be mostly important to this country would be to domestic law enforcement to be able to target anyone and everyone working with Mexican cartels / narco terrorists, providing material support to them, allowing local law enforcement a whole new set of tools and resources to be able to go after domestic drug trafficking organizations and co-conspirators operating on behalf of the cartels inside the U.S. Once again, it's not the complete answer. It's not a panacea, but it's one more tool that I think would give us some additional leverage over clearly what is a huge threat to the United States.
That's all the questions I have.
Okay, so I do see one comment. It's not a question, but it is definitely one that I think you'll want to hear from. Elizabeth Salter says, Jeff's passion hasn't waned at all from our days battling these cartels in Dallas. Great job, partner.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, those are some former DEA colleagues of mine, so God bless them.
Yes, oh, I'm glad that we've got some of them in our ranks as well. It's stunning to me, the ladies that you don't always hear about what they did in their former lives. We just meet them at meetings and we think, oh, they're really fun, but they have these really fascinating things that they've all done in their past. So this is great. Now I want to meet you, Elizabeth.
Glennis, I just want to thank your audience here for their passion and their engagement here, because you know what, this is going to take a grassroots effort to educate the public, and most people, as I said, don't have a clue how dangerous the world has become, how open borders is truly destroying our nation right in front of our eyes. It is truly the fight of our lives right now, and the Mexican cartels is only one part of it, but it's probably the biggest piece. And the more people out there that can get educated on this topic, that can engage and help inform others, I think we can start building a coalition and a momentum. So thank you for what you do in your audience.
Absolutely. Well, I did one more. Carolyn Greer said, this information needs to be distributed widely, ! Everyone needs to know the real danger we are in. I absolutely concur with that. I recommend that everyone share this video. It should be posted in the next week or so on the NFRW website in the resource library. Share it with your clubs, share it with your friends, share it. Share it with everyone. They need to know. Also, Jeff is going to be back speaking with us again in August, right? I think it's August. Yes. So we will get to speak with you one more time and get some more information. That one is going to be legalizing pot or legalizing marijuana. Let's talk pot. So that should be an interesting one. So unless there are any other questions, I think we're going to wrap it for tonight. But thank you so much, Jeff. It has been absolutely educational. I cannot tell you how much I've enjoyed it. And yeah, some of it is a little bit hard to see, a little bit hard to hear, but it's information that we need. And ladies, if you enjoyed this program, then please, I invite you to join us next month, Tuesday, July 11th. We will be discussing your legacy, leadership legacies, mentoring young women. So come back and meet us on July 11th for that. And then again in August, we'll have Jeff back talking about marijuana and the fight about legalizing marijuana and the pros and the cons and whether we've been gaslighted, because I gotta say, maybe we have been, I'm not sure we're really getting the whole scoop on that one. Anyway, so thank you very much. It has been wonderful. We can't wait to hear you again in 2 months. Ladies, it's been a slice, and I will see you next month. Ciao.